Rain poured heavily over the cracked sidewalks of Fairview, a small southern town that carried the weight of history like a millstone around its neck. The streets were mostly empty, save for the occasional passing car, headlights slicing through the sheets of water. Jackson Carter pulled his hood tighter over his head as he walked down Main Street, his footsteps muted by the rain-soaked pavement. He had lived in Fairview his whole life. He knew every street, every back road, every crack in the sidewalks. But no matter how well he knew the town, it never truly felt like home. Not to him, not to people like him. Jackson had spent the last 6 years away. College first, then a job in Atlanta. But now he was back. Not by choice. His father had passed unexpectedly, leaving behind the house Jackson had grown up in, and with it, a mess of legal paperwork and debts that had to be settled. He had planned to get in and out of town as quickly as possible, wrap things up, and leave Fairview behind for good. But then, on his second day back, the letter arrived. No return address, just a single sheet of paper, slipped under his front door. "You should have stayed gone." The words were written in bold, jagged strokes, the ink slightly smudged from the humidity. Jackson had stared at it for a long time, feeling the familiar weight settle in his chest. He knew what this was, knew exactly where it came from. Fairview had never been subtle. Sheriff Donovan sat behind his desk, chewing the end of a toothpick as he listened. Jackson had walked straight to the station after finding the letter, dropping it onto the sheriff's cluttered desk. "Anyone see who left it?" Donovan asked, picking up the note. Jackson shook his head. "Slipped under my door sometime last night." The sheriff sighed, setting the paper down. "Could be a prank. Some folks don't like change. Don't like people coming back when they were supposed to be gone for good." Jackson crossed his arms. "And what do you think?" Donovan exhaled through his nose, running a hand through his graying hair. "I think you know exactly what this is, son." Jackson's jaw tightened. "Yeah, I do." The sheriff studied him for a moment. "You want me to look into it?" Jackson huffed a humorless laugh. "You gonna find something you didn't find last time?" That shut Donovan up. They both knew how this worked. The first time it happened, Jackson had been 17. It was a Saturday night, late summer, the kind of thick heat that clung to your skin and made the air feel heavy. He had been at a party outside town, someone's barn, music blasting, laughter spilling into the night. That was when the truck pulled up. At first, he hadn't thought anything of it. It wasn't unusual for guys to show up late, trying to sneak beers or cause trouble. But then, the doors opened, and the air shifted. Travis Boone, Ricky Yates, a few others whose names didn't matter, because Jackson had seen them all before, at school, at the diner, walking down Main Street. They weren't wearing hoods. They didn't have to. Their faces were a warning, all on their own. "You don't belong here." It had happened fast. Too fast for him to react. Hands grabbed him, shoved him. Someone hit him, and he hit the ground, his head spinning. Voices laughed above him, words he barely registered. Then, a boot pressing down on his chest. "I told you before, Carter, stay where you belong." He had thought they were going to kill him. But then, headlights flooded the clearing. Sheriff Donovan's car. They scattered like roaches. The sheriff had driven him home that night. neither of them saying much. Jackson had a busted lip, bruises forming across his ribs, but he hadn't said a word. Because they both knew how this worked. The sheriff wasn't going to do anything, and Jackson was supposed to learn his lesson. He didn't. Instead, he left. But now he was back, and some people still wanted to teach him. 2 nights after the letter arrived, Jackson woke to the sound of tires crunching on gravel. His heart pounded as he sat up, throwing the blankets off. The house was silent, save for the distant rumble of an engine idling outside. He moved to the window, carefully pushing aside the curtain. A truck sat at the end of the driveway, its headlights off. Watching, Jackson's fingers curled into fists. They were testing him, seeing if he'd run. He wasn't 17 anymore. He grabbed his phone, hitting the sheriff's number. The line rang once, twice. Then it went to voicemail. The next morning, Jackson found his father's truck with slashed tires. And another note, "Go back where you came from." Jackson stood in the driveway, the paper crumpled in his grip, breathing hard. He was done. Done being polite, done pretending like this was just how things worked. So, that night, when the truck came back, Jackson was waiting. They didn't expect him to come outside. Didn't expect him to stand in the middle of the road, blocking their way. The truck's engine revved, the high beams blinding. But Jackson didn't move. The driver's door opened. Travis Boone stepped out. "Well, look at that," Travis drawled, hands in his pockets. "Thought you'd be gone by now." Jackson stared at him, jaw tight. "You're real obsessed with where I go, Travis." Travis smirked. "I just like things how they've always been." Jackson exhaled through his nose. "You mean when you got to decide who belonged?" Travis's smirk faltered. Jackson took a step closer. "I'm not scared of you anymore." Silence stretched between them. Then, from the truck, Ricky Yates called out, "Maybe you should be." Jackson didn't flinch. "Maybe you should." Another pause. Then, laughter. Travis shook his head. "You're real stupid, Carter." "Maybe," Jackson said, "but I'm still here." Travis's smirk returned, but it didn't reach his eyes. He clicked his tongue, backing toward the truck. "Ain't over, Carter." Jackson tilted his head. "Then don't run." Travis hesitated. Then, eyes screeched as they peeled away. Sheriff Donovan showed up the next morning. He didn't say much, just stood on Jackson's porch, watching him with an expression Jackson couldn't place. Finally, he said, "You really staying?" Jackson met his eyes. "I am." Donovan nodded, looking toward the road. "Then I guess we'll see what happens next." Jackson exhaled. Yeah, they would. The sun was setting over Fairview, the sky painted in deep oranges and purples, but Jackson Carter wasn't watching. He was too busy checking the locks on his doors, double-checking the windows, his fingers tense with a paranoia that had settled in like a second skin. The days since his confrontation with Travis Boone had been eerily quiet. Too quiet. And quiet in Fairview wasn't peace. It was the kind of silence that came before something broke. He had expected retaliation. Maybe another slashed tire, another anonymous letter shoved under his door. But this wasn't the same as when he was 17. Back then, they wanted to scare him. Now, they wanted him gone. The sheriff hadn't been much help. Donovan had listened, sure. had even driven by a couple times, acting like his presence meant something. But Jackson knew the game. The sheriff wasn't looking to pick sides. He was just hoping Jackson would do what was expected of him. Pack up, leave town, and let Fairview settle back into the way things had always been. But Jackson wasn't leaving. Not this time. It started with the phone calls. The first one came at 1:47 a.m. Jackson had been asleep, but the shrill ring yanked him awake like a jolt of electricity. He groaned, rubbing the sleep from his eyes as he reached for his phone. No caller ID. He hesitated, then answered. Silence. Not the kind where you could hear breathing on the other end. Not the kind where someone was waiting for you to speak first. No, this was a void, a complete absence of sound, like something was pressing in against the call itself, swallowing noise before it could exist. He stayed on the line for 7 seconds. Then it ended. The second call came the next night. 1:47 a.m. Jackson didn't answer. By the fourth night, he had stopped sleeping. He sat on his couch, staring at the clock as it ticked closer to 1:47. And right on time, the phone rang. He didn't pick up, didn't even reach for it. Instead, he stood, grabbed his father's old shotgun from behind the door, and stepped onto the porch. The night air was heavy with humidity, the cicadas screaming in the trees. The town was quiet, the street empty. But Jackson knew someone was out there. Watching, he waited. A full minute passed. Then, a flicker of movement near the end of the driveway. He lifted the gun, heart pounding as his eyes adjusted to the darkness. The silhouette was barely visible, just beyond the porch light's reach. But it was there, and it wasn't moving. Jackson tightened his grip on the shotgun. I know you're out there. No response. The shape shifted. Then, footsteps. Slow, deliberate. Whoever it was, they weren't running. They weren't hiding. They were coming straight toward him. Jackson took a step forward, planting his feet. I said, I know you're out there. A voice, low and calm, cut through the night. We just want to talk. Jackson's stomach tightened. He knew that voice. Travis Boone. The last time Travis had just wanted to talk, Jackson had ended up with bruised ribs and blood in his mouth. He exhaled through his nose, keeping the shotgun steady. Then, talk. Travis took another step forward, just enough for the porch light to catch the edge of his face. He was smiling, but not in a way that meant anything good. You're making things real difficult, Carter. Jackson cocked the shotgun. Guess you should have thought about that before slashing my tires. Travis chuckled. That wasn't me. Jackson raised an eyebrow. Right. Serious, Travis said, stepping closer. I don't waste my time with warnings. Jackson's grip tightened. That meant someone else had sent the letters. Someone else had been making the calls. Then why are you here? Jackson asked. Travis tilted his head. Because you don't get it, do you? Get what? Travis sighed, shaking his head. This ain't about old grudges, Carter. This is about Fairview. You weren't supposed to come back. You damn sure weren't supposed to stay. People are set in their ways. They don't like change. Jackson scoffed. You think I don't know that? Travis's smile faded. You're still here. Jackson nodded. Yeah, I am. Travis studied him for a long moment. Then, in a voice too even, he said, "Something's coming." Jackson stiffened. "What?" Travis exhaled, shaking his head again. "You think it's just us you need to worry about?" He took another step back, retreating into the darkness. "Might want to lock your doors, Carter." Then he was gone. Jackson didn't sleep that night. The next morning, he found another letter. This one wasn't under his door. It was nailed to his father's truck. And this time, it wasn't a warning. It was a name. Jonah Carter. Jackson's blood turned cold. Jonah Carter had been Jackson's uncle, and in 1972, Jonah Carter had gone missing. They had found his truck in the same driveway. They had never found his body. The library in Fairview was small, outdated, and mostly used by retirees who still preferred their news in print. Jackson hadn't set foot in it since high school, but he knew where he needed to go. The town records were kept in the basement, a collection of dusty boxes that no one had bothered to digitize. It took him 2 hours to find what he was looking for. Jonah Carter. Missing. Last seen leaving his home on a warm summer evening in 1972. The investigation had gone nowhere. No witnesses. No leads. But then, Jackson's breath caught as he flipped to the next page. Another name. Richard Boone. Jackson felt his stomach drop. Travis Boone's grandfather. Missing. Same night. Same circumstances. The only difference? Richard Boone had come back, but he hadn't been the same. Jackson left the library with his hands shaking. He had spent years thinking this town's ugliness was just racism and old money trying to keep things the same. But what if it was something else? Something worse? Something that had taken Jonah Carter in 1972 and brought Richard Boone back as something different? Something that was still here? Jackson exhaled slowly, his mind spinning. He had come back to Fairview expecting to fight old demons. But now, he wasn't sure the demons were human at all. Jeremiah Porter had lived in Eldemere all his life. A quiet town nestled deep in Louisiana, where the Spanish moss hung heavy from the trees and the past never quite let go. It was a town of traditions, of old money and old grudges, a place where the past was never buried, only covered in fresh coats of white paint. Jeremiah had grown up hearing stories about the house at the end of Lawson Road. A house where, in the days of his great-grandfather, a man had died screaming. They never talked about who he was, only that he had been trouble, that he had disrespected someone he shouldn't have, that he had gotten what he deserved. As a child, Jeremiah never understood why the adults grew quiet when the house was mentioned, why his mother told him not to ask questions, why his grandfather had stared at it with such hollow eyes every time they drove past. But now, at 34, he understood, because Jeremiah was the first black man to ever own that house. And Eldemere did not like that. It started small. A feeling, a shift. The day after he moved in, the mail stopped arriving. A week later, he found a dead possum nailed to his front door. Then, the phone calls. Not threats, just silence. No words, no breathing, just a dial tone, over and over again at all hours of the night. And then, one morning, the crosses appeared. 6 of them, lined up in the vacant lot across the street. Not burning, not yet, just standing there, waiting. He went to Sheriff Colton Briggs, the man who had been in charge of Eldermere's law enforcement for 25 years. Briggs leaned back in his chair, his hands resting on his stomach. Sounds like some kids messing around. Jeremiah swallowed his anger. You really think a group of kids set up 6 crosses overnight? Briggs shrugged. These things happen. Jeremiah stared at him, his jaw clenched. So you're not going to do anything? Briggs sighed, rubbing his temple. Look, Mr. Porter, you're new in town. These people, they've got roots here. You move into that house, start stirring things up, and you expect everyone to be welcoming? Jeremiah's stomach turned. What are you saying? Briggs folded his hands. I'm saying some things don't change, and some people don't want them to change. Jeremiah stood up. I don't care what people want. Briggs tilted his head. Well, you should. That night, Jeremiah didn't sleep. He sat in his living room, his father's old shotgun resting across his lap, watching the front yard, watching the crosses, watching the shadows that moved between the trees. Then, at exactly 2:17 a.m., he heard it. A voice. Low, almost a whisper. Get out. Jeremiah's grip on the shotgun tightened. A rustling sound, something moving outside the window. Then, a knock. Not at the door, at the back of the house. Jeremiah moved fast, crossing the living room in 3 strides, throwing the back door open. Nothing. Just the woods stretching behind his house. Just the wind. Just the past, pressing against him, reminding him that he was not welcome. The next day, he found the noose. It was hanging from his porch, swaying lightly in the morning breeze. A message. A warning. A reminder that he was still breathing and that someone planned to change that. He called the police again. This time, a different deputy arrived. Young, maybe mid-20s. Freckled, nervous. He looked at the noose, looked at Jeremiah. Then, without a word, he cut it down and left. No investigation. No report. Just silence. As if the message had never existed. As if Jeremiah was supposed to let it go. The next night, the fire came. Jeremiah woke to the smell of smoke. He bolted upright, his chest tight, lungs burning. The yard was burning. The crosses. All 6 of them engulfed in flames. Figures stood just beyond the fire, hidden in the dark, watching. He couldn't see their faces, but he knew who they were, who they had always been, who their fathers and grandfathers had been. The same people who had made his grandfather afraid to speak of this house. The same people who had buried the truth under layers of whitewashed history. The same people who had whispered to him in the night, "Get out." But Jeremiah wasn't leaving. Not now. Not ever. He stepped onto the porch, gun in hand, his voice ringing through the firelit night. "You want to send a message," he shouted. "You want to show me where I stand." He cocked the shotgun. "Then come do it to my face." The figures didn't move, didn't step forward, didn't run. They just stood there, watching, waiting, for him to be afraid, for him to break. But Jeremiah Porter wasn't breaking. Not tonight. Not ever. The next morning, the crosses were gone. The sheriff never came. The police never called. And the town of Eldermere pretended nothing had happened. But Jeremiah knew that this wasn't over. Because history doesn't just fade away. It waits. It lingers. It whispers through the trees and the fire and the silence, waiting for the right moment to rise again. Jeremiah Porter had lived in Eldermere for exactly 1 year since the night they tried to drive him out. A year since he had stood his ground, shotgun in hand, staring into the firelit eyes of the people who wanted him gone. A year since the crosses had burned in his yard, since the whispers had crept through the night, since he had learned the truth about the house at the end of Lawson Road. the house they never wanted a black man to own. And still he stayed, because leaving would mean they won, and Jeremiah Porter didn't lose. The noose hadn't returned. Neither had the burning crosses. But that didn't mean the town had forgotten. The stares were colder. The silence was heavier. People didn't spit at his feet, but they might as well have. His groceries took longer to scan at the store. His mail still never came on time. And when he went to the bar, no one would serve him, except for Roscoe Tillman, the bartender who had worked in Eldermere longer than half the town had been alive. One night, as Roscoe poured Jeremiah a drink, the old man muttered, "You best be careful, Porter." Jeremiah raised an eyebrow. "That a threat, Roscoe?" Roscoe shook his head, eyes still on the bottle. "Not from me, but you got people watching you, waiting." Jeremiah studied him. Waiting for what? Roscoe finally met his gaze. For history to repeat itself. Jeremiah didn't need to ask what he meant. He already knew. The first real sign came in early fall. Jeremiah had just finished working on his truck, wiping the grease from his hands, when he heard it. The knocking, not on his front door, not from the street, from the walls. Boom, boom, boom. Jeremiah froze. It wasn't pipes, it wasn't the house settling. It was deliberate, steady, like someone was knocking from inside the walls. He walked the length of the hallway, pressing his ear to the wooden panels. Silence. Then, boom, 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 louder. Right by his head, Jeremiah stepped back, jaw tight. And then the voice came. "You should have left." It wasn't whispered, it wasn't distant. It was right behind him. He turned fast, shotgun already in his grip. But no one was there. Just his living room, his couch, his father's old record player sitting in the corner, untouched. The house was empty, except for him. And yet, the air was heavy, pressing down on his chest like a weight. And that was when he noticed it. The front door. It was open. He hadn't left it open, hadn't even unlocked it. Jeremiah walked forward, slowly, carefully, scanning the darkness beyond his porch. No movement. Nothing but the trees swaying in the distance. Nothing but the silence. But then, from the tree line, something shifted. Not a person, not an animal. Something else. Something watching. And then, he stepped forward. It was a man. Or at least, it had been once. Tall, thin, dressed in a suit decades too old for this time. His skin was wrong, like it had been stretched too tight over the bones beneath. And his face was empty, not featureless, not blurred, just empty. A mouth that didn't quite belong, eyes that were too dark, a head that tilted just slightly to the side, like he was listening. And then, in a voice that did not belong in this world, he spoke. Porter. Just that. Just his name. Jeremiah's stomach twisted. His fingers tightened around the shotgun. "Who the hell are you?" The thing didn't move, didn't blink, just smiled. And then, it took a step forward. Jeremiah fired. The shotgun blast ripped through the night, echoing across the empty fields. The figure did not fall, did not even flinch. The air was thick with the scent of gunpowder and something else. Something rotten. Something old. And still the figure stood. Still the figure smiled. Then, slowly, deliberately, it raised one hand and pointed to the house. Jeremiah's house. His house. And in a voice like static, it whispered, "This ain't yours." Jeremiah didn't sleep that night. Didn't even blink. The moment the sun rose, he drove straight to Roscoe Tillman's bar, pounded on the door until the old bartender let him in. Roscoe took one look at Jeremiah's face and sighed. "You saw him, didn't you?" Jeremiah's jaw clenched. "Who is he?" Roscoe didn't answer right away, just poured a drink. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "His name was Henry Calloway." Jeremiah's breath caught. He knew that name, knew it from the stories his grandfather never finished telling. The man who had died screaming. The man who had never left the house at the end of Lawson Road. The man they had buried beneath the floorboards. And the moment Roscoe said his name, the lights flickered, the air grew thick, and outside the window across the street, a figure stood, watching, waiting, smiling. Jeremiah felt it then, felt the weight of history pressing down on him, felt the cold grip of the past wrapping around his throat. And in that moment, he knew Henry Calloway wasn't done with him yet, not even close. I was 7 the first time I learned that my skin had consequences. I was in 2nd grade sitting in a classroom where I was one of only 3 black kids in the entire school. We had just finished reading Time, and our teacher asked us to draw our favorite storybook characters. I reached for the brown crayon, eager to color in the night from my favorite book. But before I could, a girl next to me wrinkled her nose and said, "Nights aren't black." The words hit me before I even understood why they mattered. I looked down at my drawing at the dark-skinned knight I had imagined, and suddenly it felt wrong, like I had done something I wasn't supposed to. I hesitated, then slowly put the crayon back and picked up the peach one instead. I didn't know why, I just knew that I didn't want to be different. By the time I was 12, I had learned all the rules that weren't written down but that every black kid knew by heart. Don't run in public, don't argue with authority, don't wear your hoodie up in a store, don't put your hands in your pockets too long, don't reach for anything too quickly, don't speak too loudly, don't exist in a way that makes white people uncomfortable. The older I got, the more I saw the ways the world expected me to make myself smaller. In 8th grade, my teacher mispronounced my name on the first day of school. I corrected her politely, but she frowned and said, "It's too hard, do you have a nickname?" I told her no, because my name was my name, but for the rest of the year she avoided calling on me. By high school, I had learned that no matter how hard I worked, people would always assume I hadn't worked at all when I made honor roll. A teacher asked me in front of the class if I was on a scholarship, as if the only way I could succeed was if someone had given me a handout. I let it go. I let a lot of things go. But then one day, I couldn't. I was 16 walking home from a friend's house when I noticed a police car trailing behind me. I told myself not to panic, not to look nervous, just keep walking. But when I turned the corner, the car sped up and pulled alongside me. The officer rolled down his window. "Where are you headed?" "Home," I said, my voice careful, measured. "Mind if I see some ID?" I knew I didn't have to show him anything. I wasn't doing anything wrong, but I also knew what could happen if I refused, so I reached into my backpack, slowly, the way my parents had taught me since I was a kid, handed him my school ID. He looked at it, frowned. Where exactly is home? I told him. He stared at me for a long moment, then nodded. All right, get home safe. I walked away, my heart hammering in my chest. I didn't run, even though I wanted to, because I knew that running could be the difference between making it home and not. When I got inside, I told my mum what happened. She closed her eyes, exhaled slow, like she had been waiting for this moment. You did the right thing, she said. The right thing. As if existing was something that required strategy, something that could be done wrong. By the time I got to college, I thought maybe things would be different. But racism doesn't disappear, it just changes shape. In my freshman year, a professor assumed I was an athlete before a student and asked what sport I played when I told him I was there on an academic scholarship. He blinked, like he couldn't quite process it. In my sophomore year, I walked into a campus party and felt the entire room shift heads, turning eyes, scanning me like I had wandered into a place where I wasn't supposed to be. In my junior year, I got pulled over near campus. The officer said I matched the description of someone they were looking for. I asked what description. He just repeated, "Step out of the car." I spent 20 minutes on the sidewalk, hands in view, waiting for them to realize their mistake, waiting for them to let me go. They never apologized. They never explained. They just told me to have a good night and left. When I graduated, I told myself that my degree would be my armor, that it would protect me from the way the world saw me. But it didn't. At my first job interview, the hiring manager skimmed my resume, nodded approvingly, and then said, "Wow, you're so well spoken." At my second job, an executive mistook me for the janitor and asked me to empty the trash bin in his office before I had the chance to tell him I worked there. At my third job, I sat in a meeting and watched as a co-worker repeated the exact same idea I had just suggested. But this time, everyone nodded in agreement, as if they hadn't heard me speak at all. It kept happening over and over again, in ways big and small, in ways that chipped away at me bit by bit, until one day I woke up and realized I was tired. Tired of proving myself, tired of justifying my presence, tired of swallowing my anger to make other people comfortable. So I stopped. I stopped making myself smaller. I stopped accepting the backhanded compliments. I stopped staying silent when someone said something they shouldn't. I started speaking up. I started correcting people. I started saying my name loudly and clearly, so there was no excuse to get it wrong. And for the first time, I saw the way people looked at me when I refused to shrink, when I refused to make myself more digestible. They looked uncomfortable. They looked irritated. They looked surprised that I wasn't playing by the rules. But I didn't care, because I had spent my whole life following rules that were never meant to protect me. And I was done. I thought that once I stopped making myself smaller, once I stopped letting people silence me, once I stopped pretending that the world was fair, things would get easier. But I was wrong. Speaking up doesn't make racism disappear, it just makes people more uncomfortable. It started at work, a new company, a new city, a new beginning, or so I thought. I had been hired as a project manager, my credentials solid, my experience undeniable. I had done everything right, but doing everything right had never been enough. At my first team meeting, I introduced myself, went over the goals for the quarter, laid out expectations. When I finished speaking, there was a beat of silence. Then one of my colleagues, a white man in his late 50s, leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, and said, "That was impressive. I didn't expect you to be so articulate." The room tensed slightly. Some people shifted in their seats, but no one said anything. I exhaled slowly, keeping my expression neutral, and said, "I didn't expect you to be so surprised." A few people chuckled uncomfortably. He just smiled tight, like he hadn't expected me to push back. That was the moment I knew nothing had changed. 2 months in, I started noticing patterns. Emails where I was left off important decisions being made without me. Clients who automatically addressed my white colleagues first, even when I was the lead on the project. And then there were the meetings where I would make a suggestion and watch as people nodded politely but moved on, only for someone else to repeat the same thing later, and suddenly it was a great idea. I told myself to keep pushing to prove myself like I always had, but then one afternoon my boss called me into his office. He smiled the way people do when they're about to say something they think is harmless but really isn't. "We've had some feedback that you come off a little aggressive in meetings." Aggressive. I frowned, confused. I hadn't raised my voice, hadn't interrupted anyone, hadn't said anything out of line. "We just want to make sure everyone feels comfortable in the workplace." Everyone except me, apparently. I sat there staring at him, realizing that what he really meant was that I needed to shrink again, that I needed to take up less space again, that I needed to let other people talk over me again. And I was done with that. I took a slow breath and asked directly, "Do you have any specific examples of when I've been aggressive?" He blinked, looked slightly caught off guard. "Well, no, not exactly. Just some general observations." "Then I guess I'll continue as I have been," I said calmly. His lips pressed together, but he didn't push it. That was the moment I realized that it wasn't about how I spoke or what I said. It was about the fact that I existed in spaces where people like me weren't expected to. The final straw came at a company event, a networking mixer, where I was the only black person in the room. I had gotten used to that feeling, but what I wasn't used to was what happened next. I was in the middle of a conversation with a potential client when one of my co-workers, slightly drunk, leaned over and said, "You know, you're not like the others, you're one of the good ones." The words rang in my ears, my stomach twisted. The client awkwardly cleared his throat, excused himself. I turned to my co-worker and said, "The others." He laughed nervously. "You know what I mean?" "Yeah, I said I do." And I walked away. The next morning, I sat at my desk, staring at my laptop, fingers hovering over the keyboard, and I thought about all the times I had been told to let things go, to be the bigger person, to not make waves. But I was tired of being the bigger person, tired of making myself smaller to fit into spaces that weren't built for me. So I sent an email to HR detailing everything, every microaggression, every exclusion, every comment that people thought I hadn't noticed. I didn't expect anything to change, but I wanted it documented. A week later I resigned, not because I was giving up, but because I refused to keep fighting for a seat at a table that had been rigged against me from the start. My last day, as I was walking out, one of the junior employees, A young black woman stopped me. She hesitated, then said, "I read your email. Thank you for saying something." I nodded, met her eyes, and said, "Don't let them shrink you." And then I left, knowing that wherever I went next, I would never let myself shrink again.